With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here on the show, right here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. We appreciate you being with us and using, giving a little bit of your most valuable time to us here on Tactics. We appreciate you whether you're joining us on the traditional terrestrial signal on News Radio 1440 or YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, Mixer, all the different venues that we're on. We appreciate you being with us. As always, I'm your host, Caleb Colquitt. And if you're watching this live, you know that it is a Thursday afternoon. And Thursday always brings a very special guest, at least during the legislative session, to our show. The one and only Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama, joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Happy fourth week.
Yeah. It seems like it's been about 3 years at this point.
I know. It's so funny.
There's so much going on, and it's funny because there will be some weeks where it's mostly talk and not a lot of votes, and there's some weeks like this where we're really loaded up with action. So
yes, this was a busy week for sure, at least for Eagle Forum. Some of our important bills were front and center this week.
So that's actually one of the first things that I wanted to ask you about, because I know one bill in particular that y'all have been paying special attention to, and rightfully so, is that the health committees in both houses now have passed the Alabama Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act. So if you would, tell us a little bit about some of what this bill would do and the reason that Eagle Forum supports it.
Well, this is a bill that would prohibit medical procedures like hormone blockers or what they call puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or surgeries given to minors. So once they're of the legal age, then they're allowed to make those decisions. But this would just ban that practice, protecting young bodies.
Right. So this is something that I think an awful lot of people, and I've actually heard some callers and different people on different news reports talking about this when it's brought to their attention. This is something that you think about that might go on, in Los Angeles or New York City, but they don't really think about it happening in Alabama. But this is a real issue that happens right in our backyard.
It is. We do have gender clinics in the state that are giving puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to minors and referring them out for surgery. Now, I'm not saying that the surgeries are taking place here in Alabama, but there are places across the United States where 13-year-old girls are getting double mastectomies and 15-year-old boys are getting castrated. And you know what the really sad thing of all of this is that up to 98% of children that have gender dysphoria or that believe they're born in the wrong body, if they are allowed to go through natural puberty, 98% of them will reconcile with their sex and their gender, and they will go on to live normal adult lives. So the fact that we are allowing these young people to make these permanent decisions for a lifetime when they're not even capable mentally of grasping what they're doing.
Well, it's interesting to me, and because you and I have talked about this before too, you tend to lean a little bit more traditional conservative, and I tend to lean a little bit more libertarian. And because of that, even though I think being a transgender person is morally incorrect, I think they ought to be able to do what they want to when it comes to dressing the way they want to, or even to some degree with what they want to do with their own body. But that has to come after the age of 18, after the age of consent. Because we have laws against minors getting things like tattoos because it's a permanent decision that permanently alters your body. We do the same thing with things like tobacco, alcohol, because we have deemed certain people not mature enough to handle the full freedom that comes with an adult citizen of the United States. And so because of that, there are certain liberties that we hold back from them, at least for a time, until they're old enough and mature enough and can understand well enough to make that decision. And the idea that we're taking something like this, which, I mean, just irrevocably changes their body in extremely significant ways, far more so than getting a tattoo or drinking alcohol, it just goes to show that there's really no common sense legal basis for something like this.
Well, and again, yes, this just solely deals with the medical side of things. So if there is a young person who still wants to socially transition,
sure,
this bill does not affect that. They are still able to do that. This is just touching on the medical side. And we know there have been no long-term effect studies on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones given to normal, healthy children. However, we do know that giving high doses of the opposite sex hormone than you are can cause permanent sterilization. And again, these are decisions that are being made from a child's diagnosis. There is no medical test that you take that says, oh, you are a gender dysphoric person or you have this gene. This is all something that the child comes forward and says, I feel this way. And so it's the child's diagnosis that people are using as the reason to begin giving these high-powered drugs.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I use this as an example and an extreme example, but one that I think is fairly apt here. I've used it on the show before. There are parents that are as young as 3 and 4 years old allowing their child to just arbitrarily decide that they were born in the wrong body and they're really this other gender and encouraging that. And the same reason that I tell people, when I was 4 years old, I was thoroughly convinced that I was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. But thankfully, my parents were wise enough to not let me live in a sewer and be raised by a rat and eat nothing but pizza. Like, that you don't indulge a fantasy of a child to a degree. It's fine to play pretend and everything, but you don't tell them that, no, you actually are that and alter their life accordingly.
Right. I learned something yesterday from one of my friends who testified. I had not heard of this before, but she said there are people now raising what they call they babies. THEY babies. I'd never heard of that.
Yeah.
And so babies that they'll let the child decide what the child is. And to me, it's just causing such confusion with these children. And we just need to, it's such a crazy trend that is happening. But one of the ladies that testified yesterday, she's 20 years old and she was born female, but then really struggled in her teenage years. So when she was 18, she started taking testosterone and it almost killed her. She did that for a year and she was testifying yesterday saying, I cannot believe that I did this to myself. Please stop people from doing this. And she said, I was 18 and it was a horrible decision. And I wasn't old enough to really know what I was doing. And I can't believe, that 12 and 14-year-olds and even younger are going to be making these kind of decisions that are really going to mess up their bodies. And her testimony, I just appreciated her so much. And she lives here in Alabama.
Yeah. And that's another thing too, that when it comes to somebody like that that's not really mature enough to make that decision, that doesn't fully understand what they're getting themselves into, and of course, her case is a little different because she had actually reached the age of majority when that was going on. But the reason that I think that this is such a detrimental thing is because, I mean, everybody can look back at their childhood and think that there were some really stupid decisions that were made at that point, myself included. But luckily there are laws and rules and regulations in place to help minimize that as much as possible. What astounds me about this is there's a large swath of society that not only allows this to go on and thinks that it should be allowed to go on, but actually actively encourages it. And like you said, 98% of kids after going through normal puberty, because I mean, who doesn't feel awkward and out of place and like they wish that their body were different at the start of puberty? Like, that's everybody, regardless of your sexuality.
That's a very hard time in your life. And I think we can all look back on that and think, oh, that was awful. And, thinking of girls going through cramps and PMS and all this. And now the girls are being told, hey, if you don't like this, you can just be a guy. I mean, of course girls are going to jump on that because they're going to think, oh, I don't have to go through this anymore, not realizing, how their bodies are going to be so messed up by this. So it was really interesting, Caleb. They allowed for 5. We had lots of witnesses there on both sides that wanted to testify.
Sure.
But due to time constraints, 5 from the opponents and 5 for the opponents were able to speak. And 2 of our witnesses, one was threatened and one was harassed after the last hearing of the day as the meeting was breaking up. We had to get the security involved, and it just really struck me that you hear the opposition, really hates bullying, yet they are the ones that are bullying our witnesses and being so hateful. And it was really sad. And I really think people need to be aware. The LGBT crowd vowed yesterday, and I heard them on the elevator, they're going to fight this tooth and nail. The Human Rights Campaign was there. The actual state director spoke at the podium in the Senate hearing that they are not happy with this, and they see this as discrimination. We are looking solely at the health and the welfare of children until they're old enough as an adult then to make that decision. Has nothing to do with discrimination. It has nothing to do with, anything else except the medical well-being of these children.
Well, and that's what's so crazy to me throughout this whole thing is that we are dealing with kids, and that they act like that's not what's going on here, because even if you agreed that transgenderism was a real thing and that it was viable and that it was even a moral good, which of course I don't understand the idea of, especially with the high rate of children that grow out of gender dysphoria, that you would intentionally try to subject somebody to that and not say, hey, okay, if you want to wear a dress or you want to wear boys' clothes and refer to yourself by that gender, that's fine. Hold off on making any major life-altering decisions, at least until you're old enough to really understand the implications of that.
Right.
But ultimately, and what I think that this really does go back to, and I'm just going to reference this because I did a whole episode on it yesterday, so go back and watch yesterday's episode if you want all this, is that what we are fighting and what we are combating here is not really a political movement. This is essentially a rival religion because they treat it as though it is a religion. You have your heretics, you have... and because of that, these are the religious zealot types that you're talking about that, well, the other side is a heretic, and so any evil action that I take towards them is justified. I think that's really where that mindset sort of sets in. Yeah,
possibly. However...
I did want to ask you real quick, what were some of the arguments against the bill? What were some of the objections that were raised?
I think the ones that we're going to hear the most in the coming weeks when this ends up going to the floor, which could come as early as next week. The number one thing I think we're going to hear is this is a parental rights violation, that parents should be able to allow their children to do this if they want to do this. But as we talked at the top of the show, we have a lot of laws against parents harming their children. You're not allowed to do that. And these are not FDA approved drugs for this kind of condition. These are healthy, normal bodies. These are not diseased. I love to say puberty is not a disease. Right. So anyway, that's the number one. The other one they're going to throw up a lot, that sounds gross, throw out a lot, is that suicide. If these children do not get the help, these hormones that they need, then they will commit suicide. But one of the witness yesterday who went on the hormones and then is now detransitioning, she said that argument doesn't hold at all. She said, because when I was ready to start taking testosterone, I had to sign a waiver, or she had to say that if she was suicidal or going to do any self-harm, she was not allowed to take the drugs. So if a parent comes and say, hey, my kid's going to commit suicide, give them these drugs. Well, they're not supposed to take the drugs if they're suicidal.
Right.
And I just thought that was really interesting. I had not thought about that.
That was the first I'd heard about it too, but that kind of sets the whole thing in a catch-22, because if you're suicidal, then you're not allowed to transition under law.
Right. Or at least with these medications.
With the medications, not legally. But here's another thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about this, because this is an argument I hear all the time in favor of transgenderism. There have been 3 major studies, if I'm not mistaken, and each one has looked into suicide rates amongst transgendered. And when they have done this, they have found that the rate of suicide before transitioning, in other words, people that feel gender dysphoria and feel like they're a transgender person but don't go through the surgery, and the suicide rate of people that have gone through with the surgery it's less than a 1% difference, it's negligible. And actually, the ones that have gone through the surgery are the ones that have a 1% higher chance of committing suicide. So the surgery and the transition, the puberty blockers, all that is not making a difference when it comes to the suicide rate of the transgender community.
No, and as a matter of fact, there's a great study that shows that after sex reassignment surgery, those transgender people are 20 times more likely to die from suicide than the general population.
I have not seen that one.
Skyrockets. I'll send that over to you. It's just amazing. So, yeah, and one other thing, Caleb, you don't hear a lot of, but it is happening a lot, is there are people that are detransitioning,
right,
even after surgery, and they're really upset because they've really screwed their bodies up when they've gone through the surgery.
Yeah.
Sexchangeregret.com is a great website run by this guy named Walt Heyer. He came to witness for us. He lived as a woman for 8 years, and he just has an amazing story. But anyway, they have tens of thousands of people coming to the website. And he said, it's really interesting because now they're younger and younger. He gets 19, 20-year-olds calling and writing in and saying, please help me, Walt. I've screwed up my life and I want to detransition. What can I do? So, but of course, the media is not going to pick up on those stories, and they like this agenda and they want to keep it going.
Well, and that's the thing, that they basically treat it as though if the media doesn't pick up the story, it doesn't happen. And so it's really important that sources like that and sites like that do have information on these real stories is something that we highlight. I have heard one other objection that I am at least interested in kind of fleshing out. Are there any drugs or procedures that are being banned by this bill that could be medically useful in some health-related way? So in other words...
No.
So there's not.
This is if it's a child, like, for example, who has precocious puberty, which means like at 5 years old, they start going through puberty way earlier than they should. That's when these puberty blockers are allowed to be used. This bill does not touch any child that has a true medical condition that needs to be treated with hormones. This is solely for the purpose of gender change or some kind of reassignment of gender, not on a truly, medical issue, not on a true medical issue.
Right. I was having a hard time with that argument just because I couldn't think of a scenario where some of these drugs would be medically necessary, like to pump a male filled with estrogen or something like that. I couldn't think of a medical reason why, but I also was like, being somebody that observes the law and politics myself, there are times where bills, no matter how well intended, can have unintended consequences.
Yes.
So it sounds like with this one, there's really not a lot of danger of that happening.
No, not at all. And this bill was written with pediatricians, RNs, pediatric RNs, as well as some family counselors and attorneys. And yes, we want to make sure that those children that really do need these hormones and need the help, of course, they will not be harmed in any way from this. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to ask you about this. Because you've mentioned it several times, I've referenced it a couple times, this press conference that Eagle Forum put on the other day. If somebody wanted to go watch that and watch the testimonies, where would they go to find that? Yes, well, actually, I'm getting ready to put those up. And actually, it wasn't Eagle Forum that did the press conference yesterday. That was a group called the Alabama Compassion Coalition. Eagle Forum is part of that. It's Eagle Forum, the Southwest Law Institute, the Alabama Pro-Life Coalition, ALCAP, Save Alabama's Values and Education, Alabama Christian Education Association, Alabama Family Rights Association, Family Research Council, Sex Change Regret, Common Sense Campaign, and the Alabama Conservative Coalition. Those are some of the groups that make up the Compassion Coalition that had that press conference. So I will send that over to you, Caleb, and then you can post it on your sites as well. So there were some really great answers and some really great talks that came out of that press conference. I will also have links to the testimonies from the actual hearings so people can listen to those. They're only 3 minutes long, the testimonies, so it's worth listening to some of these people.
Oh, absolutely. I was thoroughly enlightened despite the very short nature of some of the things where people would come up and talk. And it was, like I said, there were several things that I learned there. There were some different perspectives thrown out there. And one thing that I wanted to sort of end on, at least with this subject, is one thing that I noticed about it, and I encourage people to go and watch these. It all did come from a place of being concerned about the people that this movement has hurt with the gender reassignment at such a young age. And that's the thing that I really want to emphasize, because so often, and you know how the media likes to play this, they act as though the only reason anybody is against this or against the transgender movement in general is just because they're a bunch of old fogey, hateful prudes that don't like anything that makes them uncomfortable. But there is a legitimate concern that is driving this for the kids that are being affected by it, and they don't want you to hear that side of the story.
Well, and I think we have a real compassion for children that are gender dysphoric. It is a real thing for many of them, and they really feel like they're living in hell and they're going through such a hard time. And I'm thankful that I didn't have to go through being a kid during this crazy time with social media and the bullying and, you know, all the awful things that kids are facing now. It's no wonder that they want to escape their lives, you know, by changing their gender, thinking that might make them feel better. And
right, but in the same way you wouldn't give.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, but in the same way you wouldn't you wouldn't say to a child that's feeling depressed, "Hey, have some alcohol; it'll make you feel better."
Yeah,
this is also not a good solution to the problems that they're having, and so it really does come from a place of wanting what's best for the kids.
Yes, absolutely. That is what this is about.
All right, so if I could transition here just for a minute. What is the status of the Senator Barfoot bill that we talked about last week? Because I know you said you'd get an update on that, where it concerns charter schools for military families.
Yes, and I wondered, so he wants to set up a military charter school for military kids, and I kept thinking, how is this going to happen? Because you have to go through the charter school commission.
Right.
So I ran into him the other night at an event and just quickly asked him, and he said, oh, no, this just kind of lays out what the school would do. I still haven't read the bill, but he said it still would have to go through the charter school commission process. But my husband is, you know, former Air Force and has worked with the military pretty much his entire career. And he was throwing out some numbers to me the other day that I want to say, don't hold me to this, but I think this is correct, that 65% of the people that move to Alabama, in the Montgomery area especially, because that's where all our schools are. That's our officers training schools and all that happen to be here. I didn't know if your people know this, but Maxwell is sort of Air University for the Air Force.
Right.
But 65% of the people that come here for school, they don't bring their families because of our bad school system in Montgomery.
That is staggering. I did not realize that.
I didn't either till he told me that. And he said it is a real concern. So I think Senator Barfoot is trying to make this a better situation for families in the military to come and, you know, have a different option besides paying for their kids to go to school or homeschooling. However, a lot of these kids are homeschooled. If they do bring their families. That's how we met a lot of people as we were homeschooling, bringing our daughter up in this area. A lot of them didn't like the school system, so they homeschooled.
Well, you know, and that was one of the things that I saw a lot of opposition to this. One of the common talking points was, why would they do this? Because ultimately it's as though they're saying that the Montgomery schools aren't good enough for the charter schools, to which I answered, well, they are too good for those schools, and so are the regular kids in Montgomery. Like, we have a failing school system. And so this isn't like we should give special treatment to military families. It's already super difficult for kids in Montgomery to get an education anyway, and that's compounded with military families. And so I see no harm done with setting up charter schools, which are public schools, by the way, on a military base that kind of caters to military families.
Yeah, and I think it's really good to point out, kind of like you just said, that this is really good for the military families because now they don't have to be separated. And, military life can be hard enough on a family because so often the military member does have to leave. But this way, when they're here for 2 years or a year at school, they can bring their families. So I think this is not going to have a lot of opposition going through. I haven't heard any blowback on that. So
yeah, it's not nearly as much of a hot button issue. I've just seen kind of some pockets of resistance to this, which, I think it's primarily people that either are unfamiliar with the school culture in Montgomery or unfamiliar with what the bill actually does. Because a lot of the common arguments I've heard against it talk about charter schools, and they'll say, well, they should be in public schools. I'm like, well, but charter schools are public schools.
Right.
But anyway, so one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, too, the Senate bill that bans the occupational tax, I know that got a vote.
Yes. Okay. So Representative Chris Sells is the one who had that bill. And actually just this afternoon, it did pass in the Senate. So I called him and I said, okay, give me the rundown on exactly what this was. And he said, this is a bill that made it through the Senate last year and it stalled in the House. But basically, there are about 50,000 people that live and work in Montgomery.
Right.
But then there's about 60,000 who live outside the city but come in to work. So what's happening is we're seeing people that are not living in Montgomery paying the taxes that would help Montgomery, and that it wasn't really super fair that all these people that don't even live there are now going to be having to pay for all of these services. And that now this bill allows them, they have to go through the legislature. This is like an ad valorem tax versus an occupational tax. He said it just adds another layer of accountability and transparency.
So
and
this doesn't actually
talk about it if you want to.
Yeah, well, I'd love to have Representative Sale on. In fact, I think I invited him once last year, but I never did. We got our wires crossed or something, and it never wound up happening. But anyway, when it comes to this, one thing that I wanted to ask, because it sounds very different based on the way you described it than a lot of people think about it. I was told that this bill would essentially ban any city occupational tax unless they got permission first from the state legislature. Is that not true? Is it just adding a second layer of oversight?
Well, that's how he explained it to me. So You're going to have to ask him. I don't want to mislead anyone.
Yeah, I understand. And I want to give, good information too, which is the reason I asked for the clarification.
Yeah.
But another thing that concerns me about this too is I had read a case where the courts had actually already ruled that Birmingham's occupational tax was unconstitutional. So wouldn't that kind of negate the need for this bill anyway? Like, wouldn't that be a moot point?
As I was listening to the Senate from my office, and then I was taking phone calls and stuff, so I didn't listen super close. But
sure,
that was one of the things that came up is, oh no, is this going to undo all those other occupational taxes in all of these other cities? And somehow I don't think it does, but that was something that I did hear come up today.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll definitely try to get Representative Sale on, and we'll try to get the story straight from the horse's mouth and get a little more detail on that, because I know, especially here in the capital city, that's something that people are concerned about because, it's essentially giving them a 1% pay cut across the board. All right. So finally, and I know that we're running low on time, but I know that this is something that is near and dear to your heart, so you'll be interested to talk about it, especially considering Election Day is coming up. Did you happen to see that Jimmy Parnell, who's the president of Alpha Farmers Federation, who of course has endorsed Amendment 1, came out with an op-ed today in Yellowhammer?
No, I didn't see it.
All right, so what I'd like to do is to just give you a couple quotes from this and get you to react to it. Okay. Because I have my own counter arguments, but sometimes it's fun for the audience to get to hear somebody else talk about it as well.
Sure.
So here was the first line that I found really interesting. Jimmy Parnell saying, "Did you know that Alabama's schools are ranked 52nd in math and 49th in reading? This is unacceptable. Yes on Amendment 1 takes the first step towards improving our schools because our current system is not working."
Okay, well, my argument to that is our failure of the school system has nothing to do with an elected school board. And even the national entities that study the structure of school boards across the country say that the structure of the state school board does not determine the success of the schools. So one of the reasons why we are so bad is that we have Common Core.
Right.
And it has been a complete failure. It has nothing to do with whether we have an elected or an appointed board.
And what I find fascinating about that is Amendment 1 essentially takes the system that we're currently using and enshrines it indefinitely.
Exactly. That's the second part.
So he's saying, our current system isn't working, so let's vote for this bill that makes the current system permanent.
Exactly.
That doesn't make any sense.
So if your listeners if they haven't heard this argument, what Caleb is saying by that is part of this bill says, and it will be enshrined in our Constitution, that Alabama must adopt national education standards.
Right.
And right now, the only recognized national standards are the Common Core standards. Mm-hmm. So we know Common Core has been a failure. We need to get rid of it. But this amendment would make us have to have national standards, which is Common Core.
Right, exactly. The second quote that I'd like to get into here, Amendment 1 gets politicians off the board and replaces them with 9 commission members who bring focus, innovation, and accountability to Alabama's K-12 education system.
Okay, well, the problem with that is that these appointed members, we will not know who they are, and they will be working for the governor and the senators who have vetted them. They will not be working for the people. It is just taking out the voice of parents. Parents need to have a close relationship with school board members. They need to be able to reach out to them. That's hard enough to do as it is, but now if it's going to be someone appointed, it's going to be even harder.
That's true, and also I find it really funny that he uses the label here of politician. He says it gets politicians out of the school board. And I'm like, have you never been around any kind of appointment, any kind of appointed office? Like, those people are definitely politicians. Now, they have to politic with elected officials as opposed to the people of Alabama, but they're definitely involved in the interstate politics of that all.
Yeah, and they're only accountable to the governor, to the one, instead of being accountable to a group of constituents who have a variety of different interests and wants. He or she will just do what the governor says.
Well, and Alabama doesn't exactly have the best track record of getting reputable governors that are known for their integrity. I mean, I hate to say that, but let's be honest about it. We could have a Governor Bentley type giving kickbacks and giving one of these cushy jobs to somebody that's going to help him cover up his affair or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider as well. Another quote, Amendment 1 clearly outlines responsibilities for the commission. Teacher certification, professional development, student assessment, and accountability. In addition, it requires adoption of educational standards to replace Common Core. Now, we've kind of already debunked this one, but,
Yes, so in the real language, that's just the ballot language. That's not the real language that is going to go in the Constitution. But what it does say for national standards is we must adopt national standards that require a seamless transfer between states, and I don't have the language right in front of me. But anyway, it's a little more detailed than what is on the actual ballot.
Well, and that's, I mean, absolutely. And we've already talked about this, how essentially it would say you have to adopt this standard, but the only option in the group of standards that it's designating is Common Core.
Exactly.
So It would be like, and I'm not getting an endorsement from a competition or anything. I'm just using this as the first example that popped in my head. It would be like saying, okay, we're using Apple products. We think that Apple products are not good, so we're going to switch from Apple products. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it part of our Constitution that we can only buy things that come out of the Mac store.
Exactly.
The only things that are in the Mac store are Apple products. So kind of a lateral movement there.
Yeah. Yes. So definitely vote no on Wednesday. It's coming up quick. It'll be before we won't have talked again since till then. But I know that there is a PAC, and Alpha has been a big supporter of that. Even Alabama Policy Institute, which we are aligned on almost everything, but this is one of those that we disagree with them. Anyway. Yeah. This PAC has a lot of money. They have about $500,000 to be running ads this weekend. And they're going to try to tell everyone that if you vote for this, we're going to get rid of Common Core. Well, it's the exact opposite. And you'll lose your right to vote. So please vote no on Tuesday. I said Wednesday. I meant Tuesday.
Yeah, that's the old trick where the Democrats vote on Wednesday, right?
That's right. Well, every day. Hey, and one
Anyway.
other thing, Caleb, a really good thing happened today in the
good.
House is the pornography resolution passed the House today.
Excellent.
And it will be heading to the governor's office shortly. So that is a really good thing. One thing off of our plate. And this will just bring awareness to the health concerns that pornography is having on our society.
Right.
To include fueling human trafficking.
Yeah, and if you're curious about what's contained within this, just go back to week 1 where we were with Becky, so 4 weeks ago, and we go into detail on that. But this isn't something that has actual weight of law. It's just a resolution stating that they're going to work on this, but it is a very important first step to solving this problem.
It is. And so any of your listeners, if they're not getting our weekly updates, they can go to alabamaeagle.org. Across the top, there's a tab that says Get Active or Get Involved. Just click on that and a drop-down menu will come on how to sign up for our emails. And every Friday, I give you an update on the bills we're watching, where they are and how you can read them and, you can find out all that stuff. And all these videos from the testimonies of the VCAP bill, the transgender bill, will be included in there as well.
All right, well, we'll make sure to do that, and like I said, if you want those updates, that's where you need to go, and we'll try to keep you updated with that. We'll try to send a link to that out on the Tactics Facebook page and our other social media platforms. So, Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. You guys have a great rest of the week.
All right, I appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, again, that is Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama. As always, it is a pleasure to have her on the show, bringing information directly from what's going on in the House and the Senate in the state of Alabama. A lot of really important things. And before we take a break, I do want to say this really quickly, because I didn't want to bring Becky in on this, because I know we talked about this with her a lot last week. I have been really disappointed in the Alabama Farmers Federation here lately. And I say this as somebody that has been involved with the Farmers Federation literally my entire life. I mean, when it comes to agriculture, I'm the son of an ag teacher. I've been around ag people my entire life. I was a state officer in FFA. I have an American degree from the FFA. I've been in countless contests, raised cattle, raised sheep. My family has raised hogs and other livestock. We've done different forms of crop production. I mean, when it comes to somebody that is involved in ag, with the exception of an actual farm kid that is raised on a farm, you can't get much more pro-ag than I am. And so I always like to give the Farmers Federation the benefit of the doubt, and they've done so many good things for the farmers of Alabama and being advocates for them. But here recently, I do not understand some of the decisions that they are making because, first of all, when it comes to this Amendment 1 thing, I don't understand why on earth they are thinking that this is a good idea and why they are advocating for voting in favor of this. And another thing that really confuses me, why have they endorsed Jeff Coleman? Because that happened in the past few weeks, that the Farmers Federation went on and endorsed Jeff Coleman, and some of the candidates that the Farmers Federation has endorsed, I've not necessarily been thrilled with. Usually they do a pretty good job of it, but a lot of times when they do that, I may have some questions about it, but at least I understand it. I have no idea why they endorsed Jeff Coleman. That threw me for a complete loop, especially when you consider that his opponent, Barry Moore, has a degree in agriculture and has been a farmer before. I just do not comprehend why on earth the Farmers Federation of all groups would be endorsing Jeff Coleman when there's no way he knows as much about agriculture or agricultural issues as Barry Moore does. It doesn't make any sense. And so I don't understand some of the decisions that they've made of late. I'm starting to worry that the Farmers Federation may have become a lot more liberal in recent years than we would like to believe. But, with the years of good things that they've done, I'm hesitant to make that call right now and to just, throw them under the bus and disown them, because I really care about the Farmers Federation. It's an organization that I personally had a lot of involvement with over the years, and I'm just sitting here scratching my head trying to figure out what's going on, and I really hope that a lot of the liberal progressive wing of Alabama politics does not have their claws dug into the Farmers Federation, because that would be a true travesty in the state of Alabama, especially a state that relies on agricultural production as much as the Yellowhammer State does. So that's kind of my last thoughts on that. So we're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a minute on tactics. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for continuing to be with us here on this Thursday afternoon on Tactics. And there is quite a bit that I wanted to get to today, but before we get into some of what is more stereotypically the news, I wanted to give us a little good news, especially because it's the end of the week, it's a Thursday, last show of the week, and so I really wanted to share this with you. Faulkner's Director of Service Learning, a man named Dennis Itson, has been honored as the Hero of Hope. So a resident of Montgomery, been here for a very long time. I don't think that he's Montgomery born, but he's certainly been a part of the community for a long period of time. And this is an award that is given, the Hero of Hope Award, that is given by the American Cancer Society. And I just wanted to say a little bit about this because I've known Dennis Itson for much longer than I've been here at Faulkner. He's been a part of my life since I was about maybe 11 or 12, and that was because his son, who's slightly older than me, used to come and preach at our church, and so we've known the Itsons for a really long time, and I wanted to, because I have a personal tie to it, and because Montgomery, it's something that really helps our community, makes it look good. This isn't just like a citywide or a statewide thing. This is a national award. A national award from the American Cancer Society, and he was selected for, and this is using their words, their criteria, quote, making an impact in the lives of others with his ongoing battle against cancer and for significant volunteer contribution to the American Cancer Society, which is certainly correct. And the point that I wanted to make with this, because you could go read the article yourself. I think AL.com put up something. Faulkner put out a press release about it, which was great. But the thing is, Dennis Itson is the kind of guy who has been making an impact on people's lives in a very significant way since before he even had cancer. And I've known him since before that took place, and I think that it emphasizes a point that we all would do well to remember. People do not become heroes, and remember, he's being honored as a hero of hope. That's what the name of the award is. But people do not become heroes by being faced with a great challenge and rising to the occasion. The truth is, the vast majority of human beings, when faced with a cataclysmic challenge, fall short. And even people that do have cancer, even if they wind up surviving for a very long time and are able to live with it, that doesn't necessarily make them heroes. How they handle it, how they react to it, if they are able to overcome and conquer that circumstance in their life. And I don't just mean by surviving, I mean by actually doing something meaningful despite the disability that they have, despite having this disease of cancer. That's what makes a hero. That's what makes that difference. And you usually don't rise to an occasion. You rise to the level of the person that you already were. And so sometimes these horrible circumstances in life, be it cancer or something completely different, something that's difficult for us to deal with, typically what happens is it doesn't make you a better person. It gives people insight into who you already were. It brings all the stuff that was underneath up to the surface. And I think that it's fair to use that as a criteria to categorize Dennis Itson. Because I knew him before the cancer hit. I knew him before he was well known in the circles of people that promote Relay for Life and other charity events. I knew him before that took place and before he had a personal interest in it. And he was the same person with the same morals. I'm not saying that he's exactly the same in every way as he was, over a decade ago now. But what I am saying is that that foundation of moral goodness, that foundation of serving the will of God and striving in everything that you do to try to do the right thing, that was already present in him way before then. And so having cancer just kind of brought that to the surface and allowed other people to see it. That's all that happened. It didn't change who he was. And the same could be said for people that find themselves in adverse circumstances all the time. And so that's why it's so important to, before some kind of cataclysm hits you and hits you right where you live, that you do that stuff first. Some people can find themselves in a really terrible situation and start improving, but the vast majority of people, that happens before that terrible event ever happens. Before their trial or whatever it is happens. A great biblical example is Job. Job didn't become a good person because of his suffering. Job was already a good person, and because of that was able to endure his suffering. That's the difference. And that's a biblical principle from throughout the Scripture, Old and New Testament. And to emphasize this idea of being somebody that impacted other people's lives, because that's something that I think I probably don't do enough of, and I wish that I were better at. And Dennis Itson's a good person to look to as an example. This is a guy that has a great family, a great loving wife, and somebody that I greatly admire in her, and also two incredibly intelligent, gifted, godly children. And Andrew has been preaching since I've known him. His first sermon that he ever gave was at my home congregation of Midway, and I was in attendance at that night. And Haley is just a delight to be around. I was actually the same year as her when I came here to Faulkner for my freshman and part of my sophomore year. And so I wouldn't say that I got to know her really well, but we did spend some time together, and it was very evident in both of their lives. I knew Andrew a little bit better than I knew Haley. But it was very evident in both of them that they had an incredibly fortunate circumstance to have the parents that they did, and that's a reflection on him as well. And this is a guy who's well-loved here at Faulkner and well-loved in the church, and personally, he made an impact on me before I ever had cancer. Because if you're looking at the story right now, and seeing somebody, oh, Caleb works at Faulkner, and this guy that also works at Faulkner is being hailed as a hero of hope, and Caleb had cancer, and this guy is somebody that works with cancer and has cancer himself, and so it kind of makes sense. Yeah, but that's the thing, like I was saying before. A lot of the impact he had on my life happened way before either of us had cancer. And we had no idea that we were both going to one day have to battle with that disease. And so make those kind of impacts, be the person that you want to be before some kind of big trial hits your life, and that's going to make you better able to withstand the onslaught of that trial. And the truth is, and I think the reason that he's being honored for this is because Brother Dennis, his fight with cancer makes mine, frankly, look like a trip to Disney World. I mean, it just does. And I'm not poor-mouthing here, but I was incredibly fortunate in my cancer treatment. I only had to go through one round, and yes, it was horrible and it made me sick as a dog, but my side effects were mild compared to most cancer patients. This is a guy that has been doing this fight for a decade and has had multiple rounds of chemo. I believe he's had radiation a couple of times, has had several surgeries. Like, this guy's been through the gauntlet. And his is persistent and keeps coming back, and mine went away in one round, and thank God hasn't come back. And I'm glad that I've been blessed with only having to go through that once, but at the same time, you look at that, and I almost think that it's not fair that my cancer is gone and his remains, because A, he's a better person than I am, and B, he's been dealing with this for 10 years, and I only had to really deal with it in earnest for about 5-6 months. I mean, that doesn't seem fair. If anything, he should have been, done and not having to deal with this anymore years before I even got cancer. And yet I got it when he was well into his fight with cancer, and I'm more or less done with mine, and he's not. And I'm grateful that I'm not, but at the same time, it almost makes you think, why is it that somebody else is having to deal with this, even though I've been lucky enough to not do that, and I'm grateful for it, but I wonder about it. But ultimately, I want to leave you with this. Accolades are great. Everybody loves a slap on the back. Everybody loves it when they get an award, and that's a good thing. And I'm glad that the American Cancer Society chose well and chose somebody that does exactly what their award says that it's for, is making an impact in people's lives, because this is somebody that works with the collegiate Relay for Life. In fact, he kind of founded the Collegiate Relay for Life here on campus. He worked with the normal Relay for Life before that, and so he has had an impact on cancer patients, cancer survivors, and people that don't necessarily have a strong tie to cancer. He's just had an impact on people, and that's the kind of person that he is. But ultimately, what I want you to remember is that even though these accolades are great, and even though Dennis Itson is certainly deserving of this one, remember, you don't need them to show the love of Christ to other people. I mean, it's a wonderful blessing, and I'm all for it. But ultimately, you don't need it. You don't need it to do the things that the gospel commands us to do. And that's the thing that you really have to remember. That's the thing that I want to drive home. As wonderful as it is, ultimately, you don't need a plaque or a medal to be a good person. And there, for every Dennis Itson there is that gets a great prestigious award like this, and I'm proud of him as I could be, there's tons of people that go through similar things that don't get awards. And they make just as big an impact. They're just as important to other people. And that's okay too. Because if you're doing it for the right reasons, and if you're doing it for the reasons that Jesus instructed us to, then getting an award is nice. It's always nice to be recognized. But ultimately, that's not why we're doing it in the first place. And the way that Dennis Itson wound up with this award is by being the person that didn't care whether he got an accolade or not. Because he did this long before that was even in the works or even in the equation. And he's somebody I look up to and hope to emulate as well. And on that note, going from super serious to super goofy, it's time for the Daily Dose of Stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And today's Daily Dose of Stupid, the federal government has seen fit to pass, and President Trump, I believe, is, according to the last news report, has signed this into law. So it passed the House quickly, it passed the Senate quickly, and the president has its signature. And this has almost unilateral bipartisan support. Very few people actually oppose this, but it is a stupid law. And I know that there's going to be people that are throwing stuff at their computer after I tell you what this law is that I'm calling stupid, but I have a good reason. Hang on, listen. There is an explanation following this. It's a law that would make lynching a federal hate crime. Now again, I know that there's going to be people incredibly angry at me for saying that this law is a really bad idea, but it has nothing to do with me not being against lynching strongly enough. I think that, frankly, anybody that is guilty and found guilty in a court of law of lynching, I have absolutely no problem with that person getting the death penalty. That is perfectly acceptable in my mind. I have no qualms about that whatsoever. And I mean, we have right here in the city of Montgomery the Equal Justice Initiative, their museum that is specifically for the victims of lynching, and I promoted it when it came out. I mean, this is a very serious subject. But this law, specifically this law, is a very bad idea. Because it's stupid on 4 different fronts, and I'm going to give you each of the reasons why this law should not have been passed. First of all, and this is the big one when it comes to most bills, unfortunately, that get passed, it is blatantly unconstitutional. And the reason that I say that is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is the one that states that any powers that are not specifically given to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the people or to the states. That's a paraphrase, of course, but that's what the 10th Amendment says. And there is a reason that just about all criminal laws are state issues and not federal issues. Now, of course, there are some exceptions, because there are certain crimes that you can commit that directly involve the United States. For example, if you were involved in some kind of plot to attack the United States at the federal level, to attack us as a country, of course you'd have the FBI on your tail, and you would have the federal courts deciding your fate if you got caught and put into a court of law, because that's something that directly deals with the federal government. And that's correct. That's the way that the system is supposed to work. But when it comes to this is something that A, is already illegal, so it's redundant on top of being unconstitutional, because the states have laws against this. And B, and this is more important, the states should be the ones to handle things like this. Now, to give an example here, the federal government has no right to say anything in this in the same way that they are not responsible for dealing with murder. When it comes to murder, with the exception of a handful of extremely rare circumstances, that's something that's handled at the state level. Well, nobody is against murder being illegal. Of course, we all agree. That's something that you would get darn close to 100%, if not 100% agreement on amongst everybody if you polled the American people on how they felt about should murder be legal or illegal. You'd get a pretty strong answer for illegal. That'd be pretty much everybody. But that does not necessarily mean that because everybody agrees that it ought to be illegal, that murder should be illegal at the federal level. Now, there are a handful of rare circumstances where murder could be considered a federal crime. For example, if you assassinated a senator, something like that, something that deals directly with the federal government, then yes, it is technically a federal crime. But by and large, the federal government correctly decided to let just about all criminal proceedings, unless it directly involves the federal government or unless it's something that crosses state lines, and because of that they have to intervene because no one state has jurisdiction over the crime. Well, if that does take place, then what we have here is a precedent that even something as horrendous as murder, it doesn't matter how heinous the crime is, it's not a federal crime because the states are supposed to be the ones that handle this. And lynching is no different. And by the way, things like kidnapping, abusing, battery, murder, already crimes. There's no reason to specifically single out lynching as a special crime because all the things that are associated with lynching, already crimes. And so I fail to see why there is a necessity for this specific designation. But the reason that this thing passed through so quickly, and even a lot of senators that I respect and absolutely understand the Constitution and understand that this is a blatantly unconstitutional law, voted for it anyway, is because of the backlash, because of the backlash from the black community on this. Because from then on, what would happen is you would be labeled as somebody that voted against the lynching protection bill. And this is one of the games that the left and the media tries to play, that if you are against this bill, regardless of your reason for it, well, then you must be chastised and cast out of polite society. The only people that voted against it, by the way, were Louis Gohmert, Tom Massey, Ted Yoho, and Justin Amash in the House of Representatives. Because they saw exactly what I'm talking about. The thing's not constitutional. Doesn't mean you're in favor of lynchings, just means you think that this should be handled at a different level by a different jurisdiction. In the same way, the left tries to play this game all the time with things like federal spending. When Rand Paul, for example, who is a fiscal conservative, says, no, we don't need to spend any more money on the food stamp program, they go, see, Rand Paul hates black children. He hates them because he wants them to go hungry. Well, that's absurd. He just doesn't want to spend any more money. Now, you may disagree with his position on that. You may think it's okay for us to spend more money, or you may think that this particular program is so important that it merits more funds being spent, even though we're we're completely tapped out as a country when it comes to the budget. But ultimately, it's just dishonest to say that the reason that he's doing it is because he hates black kids, because some black kids get food stamps. I always thought that argument was kind of racist, too, that you would assume that the not voting for more funding for the food stamp program was targeted at black people. What, like non-black people don't get food stamps? That's ridiculous. But anyway, that's ultimately what it comes down to, and the reason that so many people voted in favor of this thing, even though it probably, they looked at it and go, no, this isn't constitutional, it's because they don't want to deal with the hassle. They know that it's a largely symbolic bill, that lynchings don't really go on here in America anymore. And because of that, they just look at it as like, look, it's not worth having the fight. It's not worth having to answer a whole bunch of questions from a bunch of leftist idiot reporters that are saying, so you're in favor of lynchings now? And so I would have done what Louis Gohmert and Massey and Amash did and vote against it on constitutional grounds, but I understand why your Mike Lees and your Ted Cruzes and your other guys like that are looking at it as like, look, it's not worth the trouble. This thing's not going to make a big difference. We haven't had lynchings in this country in a very long time, and so I'm just going to vote for it so I don't have to deal with the media hassle. I think that they're wrong for doing that. I would argue with them. I'd say if they were here right now, just it bothers me that they're willing to give up, but I get the mentality is what I'm saying. Another reason, the third reason that this is stupid is because the designation of a hate crime is absurd, because what this bill does is it makes it a federal hate crime to perform a lynching. Here's the reason that's dumb. Of course it's a hate crime. Are you trying to tell me that a hate crime that's just regular murder, like if you go and string somebody up in the woods and it has nothing to do with race, that's not a hate crime? If it's two black guys or two white guys or two Hispanic guys, and one of them takes the other one and hangs him by a tree in the middle of the woods and then burns his body, yeah, that's a hate crime. Doesn't matter if it's racially motivated or not. That's the thing that is so dumb about this designation of hate crimes. All violent crimes are hate crimes. I mean, if they're done with malice, unless it was like manslaughter or something, anything that is done intentionally, if you're trying to hurt another human being, that's a hate crime. And so adding this extra, it's a double super bad murder if he was doing it because the color of his skin. Well, no, the murder is just as bad regardless of what his motivation was. I think that we could determine in sentencing if this guy is a deranged psychopath or it was a crime of passion or something like that. Like, that may make a difference in sentencing. But it's not a secondary crime because the guy happened to be of a different race or something like that. That's just silly. And the fact that that is codified as a part of our legal system is ridiculous. And then finally, and the fourth reason why this is incredibly stupid, and this is really more aimed towards the Democrats that voted in favor of it, the same Democrats that refused to, earlier this week, I think it was actually the same day that they voted on this bill, they also voted on the Born Alive bill, and the Democrats unanimously voted no on the Born Alive bill, the bill that would protect all babies that undergo abortions and survive a botched abortion and then are alive outside the womb, that bill would protect them. They all voted no on that, and their rationale for voting no on it was, look, that's something that just doesn't happen. There's no reason to add a protection onto this because this is a non-existent scenario. This is just something that Republicans made up. It's not really happening. There are no actual cases of this taking place. And so there's no reason to pass this bill. Now, the real reason that they did that is because the abortion lobby didn't want them to vote in favor of it because they don't want these protections for children that are born. Even ones that are born, if it's an unwanted child, in their mind, it's not a child. And there have been countless people that attested to this, including people like Ralph Northam. But ultimately, this is the thing that's so ridiculous about it, because this is the stated reason for this. The sponsor of the lynching bill, a Representative Billy Bush, a Democrat from Illinois, stated the purpose of this bill this way. The importance of this bill cannot be overstated. Charlottesville to El Paso, we are still being confronted with the same violent racism and hatred that took the life of Emmett, talking about Emmett Till, the namesake for this bill, and so many others. The passage of this bill will send a strong and clear message to the nation that we will not tolerate bigotry. Yeah, both of those scenarios you just cited, the ones that are modern examples, Charlottesville and El Paso, neither one of those are lynchings. Now, El Paso, definitely racially motivated. The people that were shot in that, he was definitely targeting Hispanics. And the guy definitely had some racism based on the manifesto that we had. But that's not a lynching. Lynching is completely different. And then he also tried to cite Charlottesville. Again, terrible scenario, horrible thing. Glad that guy got put away and is in jail. And he should have been for running that woman over with his car. Still not a lynching. Still illegal, still wrong, still glad that he's serving justice, and he should. But that still would not qualify as a lynching according to this bill. It doesn't make any sense. He's trying to cite the necessity of this bill by giving two scenarios that have nothing to do with lynching. And so it really is primarily just a symbolic thing at this point. But there are, by contrast, some thought leaders on the left that are calling for infanticide. Ralph Northam, just last year that we were talking about, the governor of Virginia, is saying that, well, if there was a botched abortion, what would happen is we would keep the child comfortable and move it into another room, and then after that we would have a conversation about whether or not we should be keeping the child alive with the mother. No, that's a baby that's been born, and even the vast majority of the people on the pro-choice side would say, no, at that point you have to keep it alive. That's definitely a baby. It's not even attached to its mom anymore via umbilical cord and is still alive. That's definitely a baby we need to take care of. But he's just the most prominent one that's actually an elected official. There are thought leaders that have essentially said this, that there's people that are calling for the ability to kill your children up to the point of about 2 years. And so, of course, there would be people that believe that if you can have an abortion, what's the difference whether you kill it inside the womb or 5 minutes after it's born? What's the difference in killing it 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after the birth? It's no more developed because of that. And so the only thing that has changed is its location. And this is the reason that this is the fruit of the abortion mindset that you're seeing now. That this is the logical conclusion of the mindset that it's okay to kill children as long as I don't want it. And more importantly, these aren't hypotheticals, as the Democrats are trying to present it as some kind of fantasy that, or some kind of myth that the Republicans are spreading, where there are children surviving abortions and then either not being cared for and allowed to die, or just straight up being killed themselves. Usually it's more of the former than the latter, but either way, that is happening. In Ohio, for example, there was the famous case of baby Hope, who survived a partial birth abortion and continued to survive for about 3 hours. And there was a nurse there that was instructed to bring it to a lab, but it was never looked over by a doctor. Doctors said that it wasn't going to survive, but it wasn't looked after the birth. It was just looked at immediately there, and then they just let it starve to death. I mean, these are horrible, evil people that would not give this child any medical attention because it was a survivor of a botched abortion. And furthermore, the idea that this is not just a one-off case, you can look at some of the statistics, by the way, from the federal government. If you're to look at this study that was conducted by the CDC, for example, which was looking from the years 2003 to 2014, and we'll look at the relevant part of this here, there were 588 infant deaths. So let's look at the text. This is from the CDC. Analysis of the text as reported by the cause of death certifier show that 588 deaths with mention of 143, which comes out to 24.3%, could definitely be classified as involving induced termination. It goes on later to say, however, it is possible that 143 underestimates the total number of deaths involving induced termination. So the two big takeaways from that study that the CDC conducted was that we had about 588 from botched abortions, and of that number, almost 25%, it was, I believe, 24.3% of those cases were where the child was not given adequate medical care, whether that was warmth or nutrition or whatever else, and it was basically a termination, either by neglect or a straight-up termination, when the abortion didn't succeed the first time. I mean, that ought to be horrifying to anybody. Now, granted, this is a very small percentage of the total amount of abortions. Botched abortions are not super common, because we're looking at a pretty big year span from 2003 to 2014. That's 11 years. But still, is there any other thing where we would look at and see that there are 143 children dying over the span of 11 years and saying, oh, well, that's not important. Let's not put any legal ramifications in there for anybody doing this. Let's just let them continue killing the children. No, we would never allow for that. Now, By contrast, here is another graphic. This is a study done by the Tuskegee Institute, right here in Alabama. And it was done on how many nationwide, how many lynchings were going on. So this is their findings. And you'll see that the number on the right there is the total lynchings. The last time America had a lynching was 1964. Now, of course, any number of lynchings is too many, and that is horrible, but the Democrats can't make this argument and talk out both sides of their mouth. They can't say, well, it's incredibly urgent that we go ahead and we make sure that there is legislation that would stop lynchings when we haven't had lynchings since 1964. And then say, oh, but the Born Alive bill, that scenario never happens. The freaking CDC, a portion of the federal government, did a study and said, oh, it absolutely is happening. It's rare, but at least 140 children over the past 11 years have died because of this. And here's another thing. You saw the end of that report where it said that 143 may not adequately reflect it. The reason for that is because the CDC just gathers that data by voluntary reporting. In other words, there is no obligation whatsoever for states to report this data, and there is no formalized way for the CDC to go out and collect this data. They just have it brought to them by the states because there's no law requiring them to do so. Which means that the states that are not reporting are probably the ones that are more pro-abortion. Which means that this number of 143 children that are killed either by neglect or straight up by being terminated after botched abortions, that means that probably that's a pretty lowball number. Because if you're New York or California or a very pro-abortion state, you're not going to report any of those. And so it is horrifying and stomach-churning to think about. But that's probably where we are right now. And the Democrats refuse to pass a bill that would protect these children, despite the fact that they're already born. We're not even talking about abortion anymore. We're talking about infanticide. And the Democrats are very worried and believe that there should be a federal law in place, despite the fact there are already state laws in place for this bill. Because here's the thing. If somebody on the right or the left had opposed the Born Alive bill for constitutional reasons, saying, look, I think that abortion is murder, but ultimately I believe that that's something to be handled at the state level. Or even if you were pro-abortion and said, look, the Born Alive thing, I agree that you should not kill a child once it's born, once it's already out of the womb and surviving on its own, and we should provide care for that. But the thing is, that's a very rare occurrence and it happens at the state level, and there are state protections for it, and because of that I don't want to vote for it. Okay, I see where you're coming from. I can see the argument of let's let the states handle that, but that's not an argument that a single Democrat was making. It was all, this is a fantasy, this never happens, even when the federal government itself is saying, oh yes, it absolutely does. But then they make a big priority about lynching when we haven't had that in over 50 years. Ultimately, they're political shills. And that's all it boils down to. And what disgusts me about this is that they're perfectly fine with making a bill that symbolically stops lynchings, which are no longer happening and already are on the books as illegal in all 50 states. And they refuse to lift a finger for the millions of children in this country every year that are lynched inside their mother's womb, the place where they should be the most secure. It's almost like the Democrats do not even comprehend the concept of consistency. Because when it comes to them, they're perfectly fine with tons of double standards like this. They're perfectly fine with making a priority out of a lynching bill, but completely ignoring a Born Alive bill. And then when an opponent tries to do something consistent, like Louis Gohmert, who has been a constitutionalist and always tries to vote with the Constitution and is a big states' rights guy, when he does something consistent with that, they try to make him out to be some kind of racist that is in favor of lynchings. So not only are they not consistent themselves, they don't recognize consistency in other people. And they assume the worst and try to go with the worst possible explanation of why somebody like Louis Gohmert would have opposed this. It really is like consistency is just a foreign concept to them, that they can't even understand it. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today comes from a story in the book of Matthew that Jesus is trying to give some real life application to his disciples in the form of the Sermon on the Mount. But to help you really understand where he's going with this, I thought that a secular example might be helpful. This weekend, for the first time, I sat down with some friends and watched the Disney movie from the, I guess, mid-90s, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I've never seen it before. You know, somehow that one just escaped my notice. Somehow I was just never in a situation where I saw it, and it's not something that's really considered a Disney classic. It's good, and it definitely has its moments. I liked the movie, but it's not one that's considered like a huge Disney success like Aladdin or something like that. And so somehow I just, over time, never did have an opportunity where I sat down and watched it. So we did that this weekend, and one thing that kind of struck me about this particular story is Judge Frollo, the villain character in this movie. He is having lustful thoughts about one of the other characters, Esmeralda, and I'm sorry if I'm spoiling this for you. Maybe you're like me and just haven't seen it in all these years, but I am, giving some spoilers here. So he finds himself lusting after this attractive young woman, and to deal with this, he does something that struck me as very odd, and that's he gave God two options, which, giving God a couple of options and basically telling him he has to comply with one of them, that's a super bad idea anyway. It's a really, really bad mindset to be in when you're approaching the Almighty. But he gives God two options, essentially either let me have her and let me take her and let her be my wife so that I can, sexually have her, even though they didn't expressly say that because, of course, it's a Disney movie. And then the second one there was, or let me kill her so I will no longer be tempted by her. Now, that's interesting because you'll notice that both of those options, regardless of which one came true, in both cases, they were a removal of temptation, not an overcoming of it. Which I find fascinating, that this character in this particular movie, the way that he sees it, the way he understands it, is the best possible option for him is to just have the temptation removed from him completely, to not have to deal with it anymore. Either by slaking his lust by having her as his wife, or by having her no longer existing and therefore he can't be tempted by her anymore. Now, there's a couple of reasons why that's a really dumb idea, because, of course, lust can take many different forms, and if that's the case, then are you just going to kill every woman that you're ever attracted to? And so there's a myriad of reasons why, theologically, it's a very shaky ground to be standing on, but I think to really gain some more insight and to get deeper into the issue, it makes sense for us to go to a passage that addresses lust specifically in Matthew 5, verses 27 through 30. Where Jesus says, "You have heard it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone that looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out, and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Now, Christ is very obviously using an extreme example to try to get attention, trying to get the audience, okay guys, perk up, make sure that you're dialing in to what I'm saying here. Because this is something that is shocking for modern readers as well as it would have been for people back then. And I do not believe, nor am I suggesting that Christ is literally saying, maim yourself to get rid of your temptation. What he is saying is, you go to extreme measures. That because sin is something that separates you from God, because it mars the relationship that we're supposed to have with our Heavenly Father, you do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to get that out of your life, you do it. Well, now, hang on, that sounds an awful lot like what Frollo did, isn't it? I mean, wasn't that taking extreme measures? This is a guy that was willing to and almost succeeded in carrying out his plan to murder the object of his lust to remove that temptation from him. That was Judge Frollo just carrying out what Jesus said, isn't it? Well, it should be very obvious to anybody that has either seen the movie or knows me at all that I'm going to say, heck no. But why? They do seem similar. They do seem like taking extreme measures to get sin out of your life. So what's the difference? Here's the difference. In Frollo's case, he wanted to hurt other people to have his temptation removed from him. In the case that Jesus is talking about, he is saying that a person needs to make personal sacrifices that hurt him in order to keep himself from sinning. You see, the person that takes on the harm, in Jesus' case, and the one that he presents in that scenario, is you. You're the one that sacrifices, not the other person. You're the one that takes responsibility for removing your temptation, not the other person. And I know that this is an extreme example, but it's an extreme example that has real-world application in real-life scenarios that we have. We do need to take extreme measures to do whatever it takes to get rid of our sin, but that doesn't include hurting other people in the process. You see, in our quest to remove sin from our lives, which is a noble goal, of course, we cannot allow that to act as an excuse for us to neglect our Christian duties to our brothers and sisters, or to break one of God's other laws in pursuit of that goal. See, you can't just pick and choose. You have to take the whole law, because, of course, what Frollo was missing is, in his attempt to destroy his lust, what he was doing would be destroying another human life. He would be wrathful towards this person, and he would be shedding innocent blood, somebody that has done him no wrong. And so what he was doing is he was taking one tiny little sliver of God's law that he thought was really important and made that supersede every other aspect of it. This is a common problem, not just with people in the secular world, but also with people in the church that claim to be Christians. That sometimes we'll take one little piece of God's law that we think is super important, and we'll just bulldoze over all the rest of it in pursuit of that one part that we deem the most important. But ultimately, even though Jesus did ascribe that some laws are more important than others, he said that the first law is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't say, and ignore all the other laws so that you can pursue that goal. What he said was, the entire law hangs on this, so it has priority. But you still have to follow the other laws that go with it too. And I do think it also serves as a way of telling us that you have to be intentional when it comes to sin, because sin is not going to go away on its own. You have to take action. In the example that Jesus is giving here in the Sermon on the Mount, you have to be the one that makes a decision, I'm going to get this out of my life. And I am going to take extreme measures if that's what it takes to do. Look, if you've got a problem, for example, with being lazy, maybe you have to take extreme measures with that. You have to do some things that motivate you to do something to get moving. If you have an issue with not going to church or being unempathetic, you've got to take intentional measures to try to work on that. If you have an issue with gossip, maybe you have to stop hanging around some of the people that will tempt you to gossip, at least for a little while, or maybe even permanently. If you're tempted with lust and there's one particular person that you find it really hard to be around, maybe you just don't be around that person anymore. If you have an issue with, for example, and this is one that affects a lot of men around my age in the church, and we've talked about it on this show before, if one of the things that you deal with are things like pornography, then you got to take extreme measures for that. Maybe keep your phone away from where you sleep, away from your bed, or maybe even install a self-imposed internet filter to make sure that you can't get to that stuff, or at least, and give somebody else the password so you can't even cheat. So you can't even log in and override it yourself. Or maybe create some kind of accountability with you and another Christian when it comes to whatever pet sin it is that you have that you're trying to get out of your life. The point in all of that is we have to take this fight seriously. Because if we ignore it and we take it casually and we just kind of figure, well, I have some sin, but, God's grace is enough and whatever. No, that's not what we're called to do. And if we're going to take a serious look at this or any other sin, just like Judge Frollo, we have to have that kind of zeal to get it out of our lives. We also have to be conscientious and remember that we have to follow the whole law, not just that one particular thing that we're trying to get rid of. So ultimately, our temptation has to be conquered internally. It has to be on us. We're the one that has to give the sacrifice, that has to give some things up, maybe some things that are benign and not sinful, but things that we have to give up nonetheless in the pursuit of being pure and trying to be holy the way that our Father is holy. That's what we're commanded to do. So by all means, be zealous in your pursuit of purity, but do not blame others for your own shortcomings, and most importantly, don't ignore the positive commands of God's law. Because in the situation with Judge Frollo, that problem, that inconsistency that he had where he wasn't following the law, that would have been solved not only by knowing that you're not supposed to murder somebody, which seems pretty obvious, but it also would have been solved if he had just had some love and some mercy and some grace and had been looking out for other people as opposed to just himself. And so when we pursue the eradication of sin from our lives, we should do it to the best of our ability, but we should also be very aware of the fact and be striving for doing the things that God's law commands us to do, that God wants us to do. And by doing that, that's going to help us in our quest to get sin out of our life. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media, Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.